Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hofer, and today we're going to be talking about American imperialism, which is also known as the new Manifest Destiny. Now, you're familiar with the old Manifest Destiny that took place in the first half of the uh, of the 19th century, where America is expanding ever westward, taking control of territory that had been purchased under the Louisiana Territory, acquired through war with Mexico, um, and negotiated with Britain along the northern frontier between the United States and Canada today. The big difference between Manifest Destiny and American imperialism, or at least the primary difference, is that while Manifest Destiny took place primarily on the continent of North America, American imperialism is going to be worldwide. It's going to throw the U.S. flag over territories in the far Pacific and down in the Caribbean, in places that are heavily populated by populations that are not white, not Christian, and by and large, most Americans feel that they never will be fully American. Places like Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. Now, while some of them will achieve territorial and eventually statehood status, we know others will continue to have sort of a diminutive role within the United States government as a reflection of this ideology that while the United States controls an area, that area is not necessarily American. So, the first thing we need to discuss is the causes for American imperialism. What were the overall goals here? And just like with Manifest Destiny, the expectation of new territory to fit this growing population and to either directly or indirectly suit American needs and interests. When does this come about? Well, as we move into the 1890s, Native American wars are wrapping up. The U.S. military has forced, through the Dawes Act, Native American groups onto reservations, opening up the remaining territory that's of value to American society to white settlement. And so, where do we go from here is the big question. In fact, there are philosophers who will contend that the American frontier is officially closed and there is no more private property or Wild West to be claimed or settled. And the fear that the wave of immigrants that are coming into the United States, settling in our cities, the conditions that we witnessed under the Industrial Revolution are going to lead to economic and social collapse if something isn't done. In 1893, it's a panic or depression hits when these businesses that have been growing and growing and growing through the Industrial Revolution have overextended their spending and overproduced their supplies. Prices come down, wages and spending remain stagnant, and it creates the typical economic collapse. Now, why is it that the United States overproduces? Well, eventually Europe catches up to our production of industrial goods, and competition leads to a reduction in price. And so the need for new markets that haven't been touched by Western goods is a primary objective of the United States. How about Asia? There are very few trade relationships with the Far East. And so the United States in the tail end of the 19th century start to knock on the door of China and Japan. There's a story about Admiral Perry, Matthew Perry, taking a fleet of black ships and sailing along the seacoast of Japan and China to, in one way or another, threaten or intimidate or impress those countries into opening their doors with the United States. The next reason, the third reason that American imperialism is becoming more popular is a sense of racial and cultural superiority. The United States has experienced unprecedented growth and prosperity since the end of the Civil War, and that gives Americans a strong sense of nationalism, which we've talked about before, mixed with this notion of Darwin's natural selection and the social Darwinism that we witnessed in the Industrial Revolution by those that were benefiting from that time, creates this sense that American, white, Anglo-Saxon culture was superior to those that were not so. What I have here is a quote from a minister, the Reverend Josiah Strong, in one of his sermons called Our Country, which he talks about the characteristic of Anglo-Saxon white men, almost instinctually have a genius for colonizing. That white men are unequaled in their energy and their creativity and their personal independence to take someone else's territory and modernize it. Okay, you're going to hear that term modernize a lot at the turn of the 20th century. He, the white man, excels all others in pushing his way into new countries. And if you read this verbatim, you're going to see this is a sense of pride, that this is a racial trait, he believes, of white people to take what is raw, wild, and make it civilized. We've heard it, we've seen it before. We called it social Darwinism. We called it survival of the fittest. We've seen this, and it's going to influence some very important political figures. For example, Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, who are chief advocates for imperialism in general, but the Spanish-American War specifically, and the use of the big stick diplomacy to make other countries kowtow with American ambition. This figure, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, writes this dissertation about how evolved and powerful nations are dependent on a modern navy. And so in the 1890s, we're going to see the spending on American defense, specifically in modernizing its naval fleet to incorporate or steal battleships powered by coal energy, to be at a priority. Thayer Mahan is also historically noteworthy because he's going to be the one that advocates for the construction of a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, something that we will accomplish under President Teddy Roosevelt. And his dissertation energizes and is romanticized through the publications of Pulitzer and Hearst and Yellow Journalism, as they kind of get this fever about making the world American, just as generations before Britain had the fever to make the world British. America's first tests of its imperialistic ambitions are going to take place in Latin America in the 1880s. The Secretary of State for both President James Garfield and Benjamin Harrison, a guy by the name of James Blaine, is going to develop a foreign policy that gets dubbed the Big Sister policy, okay, in Latin America. Now, I don't know how many of you have big sisters, but stereotypically, big sisters were expected to be nurturing, to be a source and guide of moral stability, and really play the motherly role to younger siblings, teaching them right from wrong and holding their hand so that they don't stumble. This is the basic argument that Blaine created about how the United States should address issues in Latin America. That Latin America should open its markets up to the United States, and in exchange, the United States would provide moral, ethical, political leadership, as well as a reliable trade partner. In 1889, the U.S. proposes to have the first Pan-American Conference in Washington, D.C. The proposals for trade alliances are flatly rejected by Latin American countries, mostly because they were able to access cheaper goods from Europe and did not want to be coveted by the United States. The second major crisis or challenge to American imperialism in the turn of the 20th century comes in 1889 and is a feud between the United States and Germany over a set of islands in the Pacific known as the Samoan Islands. The United States and the German navies come into contact there. Germany did not want to provoke the United States, and so they negotiate a treaty in 1900 between Germany, Britain, and the United States that gives the United States 76 square miles of territory, which today is called America Samoa. The Germans received two large islands. They continue to be vacation hotspots for German citizens today. And Britain is later compensated with different islands in the Pacific. But once again, the United States, though it's not a full-fledged European power, has enough military muscle, especially in its navy, to now force European juggernauts like Germany to actually come to the table and negotiate here. The final challenge or conflict that takes place here in the turn of the 20th century that challenges American imperialism before the Spanish-American War is a set of boundary disputes in Venezuela. Great Britain, as I've mentioned, was a big trade competitor with the United States, both countries being industrialized. And Britain had been going back and forth in conflict with the country of Venezuela for quite some time over a border region to the east of Venezuela that the British wanted to call British Guyana. Really, the major resource there was gold mining. And President Grover Cleveland now warned the British that it would support Venezuela in any kind of armed conflict if the British tried to take Venezuelan territory, that this kind of conflict would violate the Monroe Doctrine. And if you don't recall what the Monroe Doctrine is, be sure you go back and look. But remember, President James Monroe had said British colonization in the Western Hemisphere is closed. The British really don't give a rip. They are not legally or pragmatically swayed by Cleveland's arguments, but Cleveland continues to press the issue. He gets Congress to put a commission of experts together who will create some kind of fair border between the country of Venezuela and British Guyana, and then tells Britain that if they don't accept the terms of the negotiation, that the United States will bear arms against it on behalf of Venezuela. Now, Britain did not have an urge to fight. So in a way, Cleveland calls England's bluff because Britain really is dealing with a number of conflicts, especially in South Africa, the Boer War, as they're trying to take control of the country of South Africa. Canada is extremely vulnerable since the United States has a frontline defense. The British merchant marine that were in charge of protecting British trade were vulnerable to America's new military, new navy, and the British were preoccupied with the German naval threat off the coasts of Russia and France. They didn't need the headaches of the Western Hemisphere. So they accept the terms of this negotiated treaty. And what the major consequence then is that the United States comes out looking supreme. It's basically by default proven or maintained the Monroe Doctrine as the international law of the Western Hemisphere. And it's going to, in some respects, reinforce with the United States that this is the appropriate set of actions it should take to defending the West. In our next series, we'll look at how the United States gets embroiled in a large-scale military conflict with the old empire of Spain in the Spanish-American War. We'll also take a look at the residual consequences of the Spanish-American War as we try to maintain control of newly acquired territories in the Philippines, Guam, and within the Caribbean.